Hey everyone, today we're stepping into one of the most well-known and powerful teachings of Jesus. That's the Sermon on the Mount. And this is where Jesus lays out what life is like in his kingdom. And right from the start, he completely flips our expectations upside down. Just imagine with me the scene. Jesus is sitting on a hillside. He's surrounded by two groups of people. First there's the crowds. There's the poor, the sick, the outcasts, all the desperate ones. They were looking for hope and for healing. And then there's his disciples, this adventurous group of 12 who have committed to following him wherever he goes. And these people have been waiting for centuries for God's kingdom to come, for him to finally restore Israel and make things right. And now here is Jesus saying, it's happening. But the way he describes his kingdom is completely unexpected. Jesus opens his sermon with what we call the Beatitudes, a list of people who are blessed. Now, when we hear the word blessed, we might think of someone who has it all together, someone successful or comfortable, maybe even wealthy. But Jesus has a very different idea of what it means to be blessed. He starts with this: "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, that must have been shocking to hear. The poor in spirit? This is how the Greek world described those who had nothing. They had no wealth, no power, no social influence. And in that society, these weren't the kind of people you'd expect to inherit anything, let alone God's kingdom. But Jesus says, these are the ones who truly get it. They already know that they can't be self-reliant. They need God. And from another perspective, we can see the poor in spirit suggesting someone who recognizes their need for God. It means realizing that in the grand scheme of things, we don't bring much, if any, spiritual goodness or spiritual power or influence to the table. We don't earn God's love. We can't fix our own brokenness. But the good news? The good news is that God meets us in that place. The moment we recognize that we need him, we are in the perfect position to receive everything he has to give. And Jesus goes on. He says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Now, that doesn't sound like a blessing, does it? You know, who wants to mourn? Mourning is painful. It's messy, but Jesus is pointing to something deeper. Think about the people listening to him. Many of them were mourning their nation's oppression. They're mourning their suffering, even their separation from God. But this isn't just about them. It's about all of us who look at the world and see that something is terribly wrong. It's about those of us who feel that weight of loss and sin and injustice and just long for things to be made right. And Jesus says, you will be comforted. And this is a promise. He's not saying, cheer up, everything's fine. He's saying, I see your pain and I'm going to do something about it. Mourning is a sign that we are awake to reality. And in his kingdom, those who grieve over what is broken will one day experience God's full restoration. And then Jesus gives us another surprising statement. He says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Now, let's be honest. When's the last time you heard someone say, "Wow, that person is really meek. I really admire them"? Probably never. In our world, we're told to be assertive, to take charge, to fight for what's ours. But Jesus says it's the meek who will inherit the earth. But what does meek actually mean? It's not weakness. It's not being passive. It's not being afraid to speak up. The word Jesus uses is praus. It means strength under control. It's humility. Not seeing yourself as lesser, but seeing yourself rightly before God. Think about Moses. He's described as the most humble man who ever lived, and yet he stood up to Pharaoh and led the entire nation to freedom. Or Jesus himself, who boldly confronted injustice and yet willingly laid down his life for the world. This kind of humility isn't natural, and it's not weakness. What it is a deep trust and relationship with God. And when Jesus says the meek will inherit the earth, he's reminding us that God's justice will win in the end. We don't have to claw our way up to the top or prove our worth. God will lift up those who trust him in his time, in his way. Can you see the pattern? Jesus is describing a kingdom that operates completely differently from the world that we know. It's not about self-sufficiency, but dependence on God. It's not about avoiding pain, but trusting that God will bring comfort. It's not about grabbing power, but choosing humility and trusting God to bring justice. And here's the best part. This isn't just something we wait for in the future. The kingdom is here now. Jesus invites us to start living in it today, even as we wait for its complete fulfillment. And so the question for us is, are we willing to trust him? Are we ready to let go of our self-reliance? Are we willing to acknowledge our need for God? Are we willing to acknowledge what is broken and mourn it? Count ourselves alongside those who are in the midst of pain, believing that God will bring healing. Are we ready to embrace humility, knowing that in God's kingdom, those who surrender to him will be the ones who truly win? This is just the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, all right? So next week we'll dive into the rest of the Beatitudes, but today, let's take this challenge to heart. God's kingdom is upside down from what we expect, but it is exactly the kind of kingdom our hearts are longing for.